Good morning, I am WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to the first episode of the second rise of the Roman Empire. Book 1, Basilius Constantinos V Isauros. Chapter 1, The Byzantine-Lombard de Jura War over Taranto. The second rise of the Roman Empire is often compared to a phoenix rising from the ashes. And to be sure, it is nice imagery, and the Roman Empire had fallen very far before it rose again. Most sources cite either 770 or 741 as the date which the rise, which would take more than a century no matter how one defines the start date, first began. 741 is often picked because that is the year Constantinos V became Basilius, while 770 is picked due to it being the start of a decade, and this decade would clearly see the beginnings of the rise back to power. This book, however, argues that the proper start date should be 769, and we can even narrow it down to January of that year. At that time, the Byzantine control of Italy had been limited to the area around the Gulf of Napoli and the southern peninsulas of Italy, as well as the island of Sicily. At the start of that year, Constantinos started the first of many wars to expand Byzantine control over Italy by taking back Taranto and its surrounding area. Excerpt from Dr. Theodor Kluger's book, The Second Rise of the Roman Empire. Introduction. 2010, Schiffer Publishing. Constantinos watched as a small ship sailed down the Golden Horn toward the Aegean Sea. On board that ship was a special envoy on his way to the court of Lombardy. This envoy would be informing King Desiderius that a state of war existed between the Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Lombardy unless Desiderius agreed to give up all pretense of ruling over Taranto in southern Italy. He was betting on a war, so he ordered the themes to gather in Rhegium, Epirus, and Laodicea to march for Italy. The themes of Anatolia would probably take almost a year to gather, and then maybe as much as 9 months more before they could reach Italy, and hopefully the war would be over by then. Romanos Strategos of Epirus quietly walked to stand behind his emperor and looked over his shoulder at the Golden Horn. What is so important about Taranto that we must go to war with the Italians over it? He finally asked. As the protestator, he thought the question was a good one. Constantinos looked back for a second before returning his gaze to the horn. Inherently, nothing. However, we hold sway over Neapolis and its bay, the island of Sicily, Rhegium, and Berenice on the peninsula, but we do not hold the land that is between these enclaves, Salerno, Taranto, and Constanzario stand between a united Roman Italy, and Taranto is the first stepping point to changing that. Many men will die in the course of this war. I hope you are prepared to accept that, Romanos warned his friend. Personally, he did not see the point of such a war. Yes, the empire was at a much smaller size than it had been in the past, but instead of chasing Italian dreams, as so many former emperors had done and failed at, the focus should be stopping the incursions into Greece, the true power base of the empire. Cerinthus surged forward, his shield held in front of him strapped to his left arm. After a second or two there was resistance pushing back against his shield, and he quickly glanced up to see past the top of his shield and saw a Lombard soldier swinging down with an axe. Without consciously thinking about it, Cerinthus' sword flew out from behind the shield and managed to get past the Lombard's shield and nick his arm, throwing off the axe swing. The sword thrust was quickly followed up by Cerinthus, bringing his shield in close to his body, then pushing it out, bashing it into his opponent, while thrusting several more times in quick succession. The ferocity of his attack pushed the Lombard off balance, and Cerinthus kept pushing forward, exploiting every weakness he could find in the man's defense. As his relentless attacks continued, the forward line of the battle dissolved into a general melee as cohesion was lost. Both armies consisted almost entirely of levies that had been called up into this war. After the Lombard finally fell to a last flurry of blows, Cerinthus took a moment to look around him. He was standing in what had started the day as a wheat field, one that was almost ready to harvest, too. Now, it was a churned up mess, with all the wheat trampled into the ground. A blow to the back of his helmet sent him sprawling to the ground, face first into the wheat he was just thinking about. He rolled over just in time to get a face full of blood. A thought flashed through his mind. This is it. I'm gonna die in a wheat field outside of Attila, far from where I lived my entire life. And I'm gonna die because I had to stop and consider the destruction of a wheat field. That night, Romanos stood defiant in front of his emperor. You gave me 850 soldiers, while you had almost 2,000, and the left flank had almost 2,800. Desiderius gave his left flank almost half of his army. Of course I had to retire from the battle. You forget that of the 6,500 Roman men who died today, almost half of them were from my flank. They had 3 men for my every 2. It took everything I had to be able to keep 5,500 men alive. Constantinos considered Romanos for a minute. You have a point there, my friend. You did what you could in the face of overwhelming odds. And to be fair, you did well. You and your men held up the far flank of the Lombard army long enough for us to rout the other forces and then fall on the last remaining men. Unfortunately, the commander of that section of the army did not follow you, but covered the retreat of the Lombard army. Most of the Lombards who survived escaped, but we did capture 2 of note. Mayor Radgis of Cuneo, in the northern part of their realm, and a leader of one of the groups of levies, and Hilderic, who is also the leader of a levy, but he is yet to tell us where he hails from. Romanos nodded, and the tension and defiance melted out of his frame, his whole body visibly sagging in relief. When one was defiant to an emperor, even if one was a strategos of an important theme like Epiros, even if one was the overall commander of the military for said emperor, it never paid to be defiant for long. With Attila and Neapoli secured, shall we continue north to Capua? We can start sieges there, as well as keep this army as a vanguard, protecting the smaller sieging armies we have farther south. Give them tomorrow to rest, and then we go north. Leave behind those 2 wounded to add anything to the siege. Have them brought to Neapoli. Strategos Michael the Fat, Malicianos of Anatolia, was sitting in his tent waiting for orders. Emperor Constantinos had called up the levies of Anatolia and then told them to meet near the city of Laodicea. But all of the men had gathered months ago, and still no orders had yet come. There was a commotion by the door as one of his men abruptly entered. "Strategos, I come bearing ill news." "Do you now, Grattan? What ill news are you bringing me? Michael hoped his tone conveyed bored dismissal of the dramatic entrance. But after wasting his summer and most of the fall encamped in the mountains and apparently forgotten about, he was excited that something was happening. Grattan entered the tent fully and stood in front of his Strategos' desk. We have received word that a man named Iazakos has been stirring up the peasantry for several years now. Apparently, he has finally raised an army of sorts that is almost as large as the force here and is marching towards our camp now. The latest report we have received is that they are about 2 days' march from here. Michael slowly nodded, as one who has a long-term plan, and this new news somehow fit into that plan. Or at least that's how Michael hoped to have nodded. I see, Grattan. Thank you for the news. You are dismissed. As Grattan left, Michael called in his war council and planned on how to best use the 2 days they had to prepare for a force that numbered less than 100 shy of their own number. Michael had to admit he was impressed as he saw the so-called peasant force arrayed against his own. The 1,000-plus lightly armed and armored infantry that made up the bulk of the army was expected, of course. Although he had to admit more of them appeared to have armor and actual weapons than he would have imagined. The almost 700 archers outnumbered his own contingent of archers by quite a few. But then again, bows and arrows are not that hard to make or distribute. Some of the archers were probably hunters or poachers who knew how to shoot, but Michael would count himself very surprised if the majority of them could match his archers in skill. The part of the army that impressed him the most, however, was the cavalry. In all of the levies of Anatolia, only 166 horsemen answered the call. All of them were lightly armed and armored to be used as scouts, foragers, skirmishers, and to chase down the fleeing foes. There appeared to be the better part of 500 light cavalry in this peasant army. Due partially to the fact that they were in the mountains, and partially to where Michael and his council had picked the battle to take place, this was going to be a battle without tactics or finesse. Both sides would array their forces as close together as possible, and one side would throw itself at the other until something broke. Michael may have been the strategos and the overall commander, but at least on this day he would not lead the actual army. He would leave that in the more capable hands of Baron Alexios of Blackernay. And that would turn out to be a wonderful decision. Azakios threw his men at the better trained, better led, and much better equipped Roman army, leading to the death of less than 850 men on both sides out of 4,500. And 610 of those who died would be from Azakios' peasant force. After the third charge, the peasants broke, and the Roman cavalry hunted them down as the peasants melted away into the wilderness to make it back home. Azakios was found on a horse with a small horse bodyguard surrounding him. He was publicly hanged in the center of Laodicea, and his head was tarred and left on a pike next to the main entrance to Laodicea for almost a year after, to serve as a reminder to those who may wish to rebel. Thank you for listening, and make sure to tune in tomorrow as we begin Sun Tzu's The Art of War.